They said Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero had a look in his eyes, one that could freeze you in your tracks. Not because he was a killer, but because you never knew what was behind that calm stare. It was like he was always measuring the world, figuring out who to trust and who to betray. The story of Lefty begins in a place that most would forget, the streets of Brooklyn, New York. It wasn't the glitz of the city's lights or the power of the high towers that shaped him. It was the grimy corners, the alleyways where the sounds of cars screeching and men shouting were a soundtrack to everyday life. At the age of 16, Lefty was already carving his name into the pavement. The lessons were harsh, but clear: you either take or get taken. He worked his way up through the ranks, learning from the likes of wise guys who'd lived their whole lives by a set of unspoken rules. But in the back of his mind, there was always one question: was loyalty the real price to pay? You could see the weight of those thoughts in his eyes, as he walked the streets, learning fast, watching close. But there was a line he'd cross, and he didn't even know it yet. Lefty didn't start as a killer. He wasn't born with the fire in his eyes that would later define him. No, at first, he was just a young man with ambition. His loyalty ran deep, especially to the men who first gave him a shot, but even deeper was his understanding of survival. It was a game of giving and taking. Sometimes you held onto your word, sometimes you let it slip away. Brooklyn in the 1950s wasn't a place for soft men. The neighborhood was a mix of old-world immigrants, tough kids looking for a way out, and mobsters carving out their territories in a city that never seemed to sleep. Lefty spent hours at the corner diner, talking business and watching the men who had already built their empires. He learned the rules the hard way, but it wasn't just about power, it was about respect. In this world, respect was the currency, and Lefty was going to earn it. He was calm in ways that made people nervous. He never rushed, never shouted. His words were measured, his actions deliberate. In the end, it was that stillness that made him different. He wasn't in it for the flash, the fame, or the fortune. He wanted the kind of loyalty that could never be bought. But even that came with its price. The trust he had in others would soon be tested in ways he could never have anticipated. Lefty's rise wasn't fast, but it was steady. He didn't make waves, he made friends, and more importantly, he made alliances. By the time he hit his early 30s, he was already trusted by some of the most powerful men in the mob. His ability to stay out of the spotlight while pulling the strings in the background earned him respect from those who knew how to spot potential. And there was no shortage of ambition in his heart. He moved from small-time jobs to bigger operations, managing rackets and ensuring everything ran smoothly. His reputation as a problem solver grew. If something went wrong, people called Lefty, and when Lefty walked into a room, the air shifted. It wasn't just his presence, it was the way he handled situations with a quiet authority. He never had to scream. His calm voice and slow, calculated movements said everything that needed to be said. But as his influence expanded, so did the enemies he made. The world he'd created, the world that valued loyalty above all else, wasn't as perfect as it seemed. There were cracks in the foundation, and Lefty started to feel them. Every deal he made, every handshake he exchanged, left him with one lingering question: who could he truly trust? The higher he climbed, the more he realized, trust wasn't just a luxury, it was a dangerous game. By his mid-30s, Lefty had reached a level of control that few could match. He wasn't just a member of the crew anymore, he was the one calling shots, directing operations, and keeping the peace within the family. His decisions carried weight, and his word had become law. The men who once mentored him now looked to him for guidance, for answers to questions they themselves didn't have. He had earned their respect, but it was more than just power, it was about maintaining order. In the chaotic world of organized crime, the ability to keep everything running smoothly was a rare skill. Lefty wasn't just a muscle, he was the calm in the storm, the stabilizing force that held everything together. He saw himself as a protector of the system, the keeper of the rules. People knew where they stood with him, and that certainty made him invaluable. But with power came paranoia. The deeper he went, the more he realized how fragile everything was. One wrong move, one slip of the tongue, and everything he built could come crashing down. He had seen it happen to others, men who had been close to the top, and just like that, they were gone. Lefty, however, was calculated. He wouldn't make the same mistakes. As Lefty grew more entrenched in the underworld, the sense of invincibility that came with his power began to wane. The cracks in loyalty, those small, almost invisible fissures, began to show. At first, it was minor, unspoken things, a whispered rumor here, a quiet disagreement there. But the more Lefty looked, the more he saw signs of betrayal, even from the people closest to him. He had always been able to read people, their body language, their eyes, the way they spoke. But now, those signs became harder to ignore. His trusted lieutenants were making deals behind his back, his closest friends were beginning to act differently. He felt the shift in the air, the slow, almost imperceptible change in tone. Was it paranoia? Or had the loyalty he'd built his world on really begun to crack? One evening, after a tense meeting, Lefty walked the quiet streets of Brooklyn, lost in thought. His hands were buried in the pockets of his coat, his mind racing. He replayed every conversation, every handshake, every moment where something didn't feel right. He stopped in front of his favorite diner, the same place where he used to meet old friends and talk about the future. The neon sign buzzed faintly in the background, but all he could hear was the sound of his own thoughts, spiraling. It wasn't just about business anymore. It was about trust, and for the first time, Lefty wasn't sure he had any left. The whispers of betrayal weren't just coming from his own men, there were other forces at play. Lefty had been feeling the eyes of the world on him for some time now, but when the FBI started to make their presence known, the paranoia hit hard. It was subtle at first, like a shadow lurking just outside the edges of his vision. Phone calls were tapped, meetings were watched, and the whispers of his men became more cautious, as if they were all waiting for something to snap. Lefty had always kept his cards close to his chest, but now, every move he made felt like it was being scrutinized. He'd always been good at reading people, but now he couldn't even trust his own instincts. His nerves were frayed, his once calm demeanor showing signs of wear. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone was always listening, always waiting for him to slip up. One night, in the dimly lit back room of a bar, Lefty sat with one of his closest associates, Polly. They spoke in hushed tones, but even then, Lefty couldn't escape the feeling that every word was being recorded. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "You trust anyone in this business anymore, Polly?" Lefty asked, his eyes scanning the room, lingering on every face. Polly's eyes flickered nervously. "I don't know, Lefty. I just don't know." That was when Lefty realized he wasn't just fighting his enemies anymore. He was fighting himself. The pressure built quietly at first, like a storm gathering on the horizon. Lefty had always prided himself on his ability to control the narrative, to keep everything under wraps. But now, every conversation felt like a thread unraveling. Every ally seemed to be questioning him, even if they didn't say it aloud. He knew the FBI was closing in, but he didn't know who was still loyal, or who had already sold him out. Then it happened. One cold winter's night, Lefty received a phone call that would change everything. The voice on the other end was familiar, but not welcome. It was a man he trusted, someone he'd mentored. A man who, just days before, had sworn to never turn his back on Lefty. "They got me, Lefty," the voice said, panic edging the words. "I had no choice. They've got everything, your name, the books, everything." The weight of those words hit harder than a bullet to the chest. Lefty's body went still as the phone slipped from his hand, the realization sinking in. It was all coming apart, not from outside pressure, but from within. His own blood, his own men, were the ones who had betrayed him. The system he had built, the loyalty he thought was ironclad, was crumbling beneath him. Lefty sat in silence, staring out the window, his mind spinning. He had made enemies, but never like this. Betrayal wasn't supposed to come from those closest to you. That wasn't how the game worked. But now, the game was over. Lefty's world had once been full of voices, loud, brash, constant. Now, in prison, silence was his only companion. The walls were thick, and the air was cold, but it was the isolation that gnawed at him most. For the first time, he wasn't in control. He wasn't the one calling the shots. He wasn't the one everyone feared or respected. He was just another man behind bars, forgotten by most, save for the whispers that still lingered in the shadows of his past. He spent his days in a small, dimly lit cell, watching the sun rise and set through the tiny window above. The same routine, day after day. He kept to himself, his mind racing, replaying every moment that had led him to this point. He had outlived so many of his enemies, avoided so many traps, yet, this was the one he couldn't escape. One day, as he sat on the edge of his bed, his hands clasped together, an old friend came to visit, not someone from the old crew, but someone from the past. A man who had always admired Lefty's cool, steady demeanor. He sat across from him, uncomfortable in the sterile prison chair, and spoke in hushed tones. "Lefty," the man said softly, "you've got wisdom, you know? You always did. You think you'll ever find peace?" Lefty looked at him, his eyes hard but distant. "Peace," he repeated, his voice a whisper. "I'm just trying to survive." It wasn't peace Lefty wanted anymore. It was redemption. But in the quiet of his cell, even that felt unreachable. Years passed behind those cold prison walls, and Lefty's once strong grip on his world began to slip further away. Time was a slow killer, it wore him down in ways the streets never had. His face, once sharp and full of calculation, was now softer, lined with age and regret. The men who had once feared him were now either gone or forgotten, and Lefty's name had faded from the mouths of those who once whispered it with respect. But even in the silence of his cell, he was still a man with a legacy. Not the kind of legacy that comes with wealth, power, or control. No, his was a quieter one, a legacy of loyalty, mistakes, and lessons learned too late. Every day in prison was a meditation on the choices he'd made. He had built an empire on trust, and when that trust was broken, so was he. Lefty's thoughts often drifted to his old crew, to the men who had betrayed him, and to those who had stood by his side. What would they remember of him? He wondered. Would they remember the man who had kept everything running, the man who believed in loyalty even when it cost him everything? Or would they forget the man who had been brought down by his own trust? One evening, as the sun set behind the iron bars of his window, Lefty's reflection on his past was interrupted by a soft knock at the door. He didn't expect anyone. The only thing left for him now was time, but it seemed, even in the final stretch of his life, the past had one more chapter to write. Lefty sat by his cell window, the fading light casting long shadows across the concrete floor. His hands trembled slightly as he folded the pages of his life in his mind, the deals, the betrayals, the mistakes, and the moments when loyalty had shone bright like a beacon. All of it had brought him here, to this small room with nothing left but the echoes of a past he couldn't change. As the years slipped away, he came to understand something: survival was never about strength or power. It was about the people you trusted. And in the end, it wasn't the enemies he feared, but the ones who had once sworn to stand by him. That was the harshest lesson of all. The betrayal didn't just hurt, it killed a part of him, slowly, over time. But through the quiet reflection, something else emerged: peace. Not the kind he had once imagined, but the kind that comes with knowing who you really are, even when the world has left you behind. Lefty had survived more than anyone ever expected. And now, in the silence of his cell, he could finally accept it. Never break your word, he had once told himself, years ago, sitting at a table with men he thought he could trust. It's all you have left when everything else falls apart. He had outlived the world he built, not because he was lucky, but because he never broke his word. And with that quiet truth, Lefty Ruggiero's story came to its end. Don't forget to like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more gangster stories like this one.